Good day to you. Would you like to join me on my walk to campus as we walk across many different sights and sounds in the background? Because that's kind of what's going on in the European Union. Yeah, the European Union is a really difficult concept to grasp. And I bet that even though many of you have already read the chapter on it, we did get reversed up this week because of my error in the schedule, but even though many of you have read about the European Union, some of you have even been to European countries, you're probably still wondering what exactly is the European Union. So I'm going to take the opportunity of the instructor video today to try and elaborate on some ideas that were talked about in the chapter and get across really some more detail and bring it into sharper focus what this body is. And it all starts really with thinking about the antecedent for the European Union. The antecedent is what comes before, right? And that's a historical context. In this case, for the European Union, it's World War I and World War II. Two wars which ravaged Europe. I mean, you don't even have to have studied history to know about Hitler, to know about the bombings that went on, to know about the destruction of cities, to know about the Holocaust, to know about countries being run over by other countries. Yeah, my own family, lots of deaths from World War II coming from Britain. So this is the context. After World War II, the governments of individual countries said, we want to do everything we can so that we never have this problem again of warring across the entire continent. And so they established the European Economic Union, as it used to be known, the EEU. European Economic Union, EEU, and it later became the European Union, which kind of speaks to the main purpose behind the EU in the beginning, which was to encourage economic cooperation between the nations that were part of the EU. To gain membership into the EU, you have to go through a very serious application process today. It's very difficult to get into the EU, but they're always considering new members. There are plenty of countries still in that zone. But at the time when the EU was first founded, it was mainly about establishing not competition, but cooperation between those countries, economic cooperation. And so you don't have a country that is really capable of producing something very cheaply, like France can produce bread really cheaply just because of the natural ingredients there. You don't want France dumping cheap bread on the British market so that it hurts British bread makers. And that's what the EU normally started around. The same was extended to media, right? So media is all about cooperation and ultimately to lead to the flow of audiovisual media, in particular, radio, TV, film, across borders. So that even though a television series like Money Heist is produced in Spain, that it should be easily seen in Sweden and Italy and lots of other countries in the European Union. So that's the original impetus for the European Union, was economic cooperation. And then later on, it doesn't talk about this much in the book, it really moved more into human rights and human progress, you can even call it. So they have laws against child trafficking, for example, that apply to any EU member nation. And even when you talk about children within media, because the EU has the power to regulate European member countries. Even within the European Union, when it comes to regulation and children are much more protected than they are in the United States. There's a very strict limit on how many advertisements and that you can include in children's programming, and advertisements in general are not allowed to be targeted at children at all. I mean, they're vulnerable, right? They don't know the difference between a good expense and a bad expense. They'll take the super sugared up, colorful cereal in the aisle just about every time. So you have a lot more protection going on in the European Union. Now, there are two legislative bodies, two policy-making bodies that when you try and study the EU, you get a handle on, you want to know about them. They have the hierarchy, the organizational hierarchy within them. So you've got the European Commission, and that's a small body. It's a group of people. They are not elected. They can come from any countries in Europe. And you have the head commissioner who's in charge of that. And they're really setting policy. You know, like many organizations, they have a board of directors That's not, the most appropriate metaphor, but it kind of speaks to what the European Commission is like. And then you also have the European Parliament. The European Parliament is an actual governing body with representation of people from each and every country who are elected to that European Parliament. They go to represent countries. Now, as you know, I mentioned Britain a little while ago. I've been following the EU for a long time. I've seen it when it had a bunch of members. I've seen it when it didn't have some members, like Macedonia down in Greece and Turkey trying to get in. But I also saw, as you saw, the exit of Britain from the European Union. Britain said the regulations are too strong for us anymore, and we want to have our own autonomy. So we're pulling out of the EU. That's what Brexit was all about. All right, so the EU has this treaty, and the treaty that was written, Treaty of Amsterdam, the treaty does several things, including trying to make all of Europe a single audiovisual market, all of Europe. So when you think about, like I said earlier, a television show that's produced, say, Pop Idol in Britain, Pop Idol, that show should have a market not just of Britain, but of the entire European continent when it comes to EU countries. Not everybody's going to be interested in it. If you don't speak English, or if you're in a region, another country where English is not spoken, then perhaps not. Another thing that the treaty tried to attempt was to have media-specific funding. And you will find that across the board in Europe, there's a lot more funding that's put up by governments to support creative media, that is, media that are not dominated by corporate profit-making interests. These are independent production companies. They are young people out of college. They are filmmakers trying to make it. They are people taking on subjects that would not be addressed by commercial making media. Like in France, cheese making is really important to French culture. Let me tell you, there are lots of regions of France where the town is all about the cheese that's made there. And so to keep that tradition going, because the cheese is so delicious, so many varieties of it, but generally speaking, very creamy cheeses in France, you may need to have the preservation of that through a documentary so that future generations can be taught this cheese making as it becomes harder and harder to pass that on. That's what Europe has a lot more of than certainly in the United States, although the United States does fund PBS. So we have media-specific funding. It happens for film, happens for TV. And also, just in the area of public service broadcasting, later on in the chapter, it talks about public service broadcasting as being more prominent across European countries. So here in the United States, we have NPR, National Public Radio. We have PBS, the Public Broadcasting System, and that's it. It's like 2 channels. One is on radio and one is on TV. And it takes you have to scroll on your TV up to channel 24 or 22, I can't remember where it is, before you actually come to PBS. So long before a viewer gets to PBS, they're going to get picked off, if you want to think of it that way, by a CBS or Fox or any of the other channels that come before. That's not the case when you go across Europe. When you go across Europe, you open up you turn on that TV with your remote and you start going up through the channels. Of the first 6 channels, maybe 3 of them are going to be public service channels, providing content that is funded by license fees. Every time a person purchases a TV set, they have to pay a tax, about $400 in the United Kingdom. Not every time you purchase TV. If you have one TV in your house, you pay the tax. And then that tax is used to fund public service content. In Britain, the BBC is what produces it, but you have the same thing going on across Europe. All right, moving on now. Something else that the treaty tried to accomplish was enforcing media literacy and pluralism. Pluralism, that's very important. I can remember interviewing for my book, Comparing Media from Around the World, a French official who worked for the equivalent of the FCC. I went to Paris to interview her, and I took an elevator to the 11th floor on the banks of the Seine. That's the river that runs through Paris, the Seine. And I interviewed her. Remember, she was wearing sneakers. It was Dress Down Friday. And she was talking to me about how important it is in France to have pluralism in radio, such that if you want to be a new radio station, you want to enter the market and have a radio station, you have to prove that you're adding to the plurality of voices on radio, because France never wants to go back to Nazi Germany. France was taken over by Nazi Germany, and just a lot of people believe caved in to the forces. And so plurality or pluralism is a way to combat that. And she actually said to me, we have Jewish radio, we have anarchist radio, we have right-wing radio, we have socialist radio, we have communist radio. That's France, and that's pluralism. And you find that in European Union policies. And finally, and this one's still being worked out, is the treaty provides for promoting and improving online content, specifically making online content safe. And I can tell you, I've been in Europe a few times in the last few years, and I'm amazed at every time I go to a website, I have to accept that the website is going to be mining my PC or my phone for cookies. And do I accept before I go on? And that's part of the European protection approach, protection of the individual consumer. You find it stronger in Europe than you do in the US. Again, a lot of it is born out of that World War mentality that Europe went through. Amongst the provisions in this treaty is the TV Without Frontiers standards, television without frontier standards. And I can just tell you, it doesn't matter what European country you're in, at night, you will find TV shows from all over the world, including the United States. So I'll be sitting in a Swedish living room, turn the TV on. There's a film from Lithuania. There's a sitcom from the US. There's a soccer match or a football match from Britain. And that's what TV with Frontiers is meant to try and achieve. But also it's meant to again, along these human dimensions I was talking about earlier, combat things like racial hatred. To have provisions in place that the TV is not used as a tool like it was in Nazi Germany for racial divisions. All right, I want to mention something about newspapers now, because the European Union has gotten involved here in a way that you don't see in the United States. So in an effort to preserve pluralism, to have many voices, to not just have one newspaper with one particular ideology dominating a serious discussion about policy, many European governments, through the urging of the EU, actually provide subsidies to newspapers that are the second most popular newspaper. And the reason for that is because they don't have the financial strength of being the most popular newspaper, and yet their voice is still important, so they need to be subsidized and they need to receive some funding to help compete and make sure that that voice is part of democracy. So I've actually seen a scenario in Sweden where the governing party was a socialist party, and they were funding the second newspaper in the city of Stockholm, which was a conservative newspaper. And I just found that so amazing. You never see that in the US. You never see a Democratic government funding a Republican-oriented newspaper or vice versa. All right, which brings us to the end for today, and that's to consider two issues that the EU is facing, right? Because it's like this amorphous thing, right? It's like an entity that doesn't exist in any one country, but it has say over all of them, but not total say, because each country has its own government, right? So it's still tough to get a handle on what exactly the EU is, but two issues that the EU policy will face when it comes to media. Number one is convergence. You still have everything pushing towards a cell phone, all kinds of media content, film, newspapers, everything pushing towards the cell phone. And that does create challenges for a safe environment, for an online environment, from predators and stalkers and bullying and trafficking and children being exposed to content that they shouldn't be exposed to until they're more adult. Media convergence is creating a lot of issues in creating safety for those groups in the online environment. And then lastly, the balance that the EU is trying to strike still continues to try and strike. They didn't strike it well enough for Britain's point of view. That's why you have Brexit. And that is the balance between having competitiveness, definitely having competitiveness between production companies and media ownership groups, but at the same time, maintaining cultural diversity. I mean, there's no way that you want the Portuguese people to open their restaurants earlier than 7 o'clock, because if they do, they're changing their culture. even though it may be inconvenient for people who are more from Northern Europe and they're wanting to go to eat at 5 o'clock. That's not Portuguese culture. So you got to find a way for media not to portray differences that start to erase the cultural uniqueness of each individual culture. So you got the balance. I'm still talking about the balance between competitiveness, cultural diversity, and then finally consumer protection. Consumer protection is about making sure that the individual person, the person who is susceptible to the power of big media companies, to the power of government, to the power of financial groups, that person has to have rights in the European system. And juggling all those three things together, it requires some delicate dancing: competitiveness, cultural diversity, and consumer protection. All three of them wrapped up into one. Have a great day.